Good morning, good morning. This is Robert Frank, and this is June 18th, and Tuesday, June 18th, and we're reading still from the book, The Celestine Prophecy, James Redfield. And if you recall last time, he went to see Dobson at his hotel, and there was a bunch of noise and trucks and lights and police, and then he got shot at, and he started to run, and that's where we basically left off. And so we'll go ahead and start where we left off. So I will continue reading from that point. Wait a minute, someone said in a loud whisper from behind my left shoulder. I started to run, but he reached out and grabbed my arm. Please, wait a minute, he said again. I saw what happened. I'm trying to help you. Who are you? I asked, trembling. I'm Wilson James, he said. I'll explain later. Right now, we have to get off the streets. Something about his voice and his demeanor calmed my panic, so I decided to follow him. We walked up the street and into a leather goods store, and he nodded to a man behind the counter and led me into a musty spare room in the back. He shut the door and closed the curtains. He was a man in his 60s, although he seemed much younger. A sparkle in his eyes or something. His skin was dark brown and his hair was black. He looked of Peruvian descent, but the English he spoke sounded almost American. He wore a bright blue t-shirt and jeans. You'll be safe here for a while, he said. Why are they chasing you? I didn't respond. You've heard about the manuscript, haven't you? He asked. How did you know that? I guess the man with you was here for that reason too. Yes, his name is Dobson. How did you know there was two of us? I have a room over the alley. I was looking out the window as they were chasing you. Did they shoot Dobson? I asked, terrified by what I might hear in the reply. I don't know, he said. I couldn't tell, but once I saw you had escaped, I ran down the back steps to head you off. I thought perhaps I could help you. Why? For an instant, he looked at me as though he was uncertain how to answer my question. Then his expression changed to one of warmth. You won't understand this, but I was standing there at the window and thoughts about an old friend came to me. He's dead now. He died because he thought the people should know about the manuscript. When I saw what was happening in the alley, I felt I should help you. He was right. I didn't understand. But I had the feeling he was being absolutely truthful with me. I was about to ask another question when he spoke again. We can talk about this later, he said. I think we'd better move to a safer place. Wait a minute, Wilson, I said. I just want to find a way back to the States. How can I do this? Call me Will, he replied. I don't think you should try the airport. Not yet. If they're still looking for you, they will be checking there. I have some friends who live out of town. They will hide you. There are several other ways out of the country you can choose. When you're ready, they will show you where to go. He opened the door to the room and checked inside the shop, then walked outside and checked the street. When he returned, he motioned for me to follow. We walked down the street to a blue Jeep that Will pointed out, and as we got in, I noticed that the back seat was carefully packed with foodstuff and tents and satchels, and as it for an extended trip. We rode in silence I leaned back in the passenger seat and tried to think. My stomach was knotted with fear. I had never expected this. What if I had been arrested and thrown into a Peruvian jail or killed outright? I had to size up my situation. I had no clothes, but I did have money and one credit card. And for some reason, I trusted Will. What had you and who was it, Dobson, done to get those people after you? Will asked suddenly. Nothing that I know of, I replied. I met Dobson on the plane. He's an historian and he was coming down here to investigate the manuscript officially. He represents a group of other scientists. Will looked surprised. Did the government know he was coming? Yes. He had written certain government officials that he wanted cooperation. I can't believe they tried to arrest him. He didn't even have his copies with him. He has copies of the manuscript. Only the first two insights. I had no idea there were copies in the United States. Where did you get them? On an earlier trip, he was told a certain priest knew of the manuscript. He couldn't find him, but he found the copies hidden behind his house. Will looked sad. Jose. Who? I asked. He was the friend I told you about, the one who was killed. He was adamant that as many people as possible hear about the manuscript. What happened to him? He was murdered. We don't know why or by whom. His body was found in the forest miles from his house. But I have to think it was his enemies, the government. Certain people in the government or in the church. His church would go that far? Perhaps. The church is secretly against the manuscript. There are a few priests who understand the document and advocate it covertly, but they must be very careful. Jose talked of it openly to anyone who wanted to know. I warned him for months before his death to be more stubble, to stop giving copies to anyone who came along. He told me he was doing what he knew best, and he knew he must. What the manuscript was first discovered, I asked. It was first translated 3 years ago, but no one knows when it was first discovered. The original floated around for years, we think, among the Indians until it was found by Jose. He alone managed to get it translated. Of course, once the church found out what the manuscript said, they tried to suppress it totally. Now all we have are copies. We think they destroyed the original. Will had driven east out of town and we were riding on a narrow 2-lane road through a heavily irrigated area. We passed several small plank dwellings and then a large pasture with expensive fencing. Did Dobson tell you about the first two insights? Will asked. He told me about the second insight, I replied. I have a friend who told me of the first. She talked to a priest at another time. To Jose, I guess. Do you understand these two insights? I think so. Do you understand that chance encounters often have a deep meaning? It seems, I said, like this whole trip has been one coincident event after another. That begins to happen once you become alert and connected with the energy. Connected? Will smiled. That's something mentioned further in the manuscript. I'd like to hear about it, I said. Let's talk about it later, he said, indicating with a nod that he was turning the vehicle onto a gravel driveway. 100 feet ahead was a modest wood frame house. Will pulled up beneath a large tree to the right of the house and stopped. My friend works for the owner of a large farming estate who owns much of the land in this area, he said, and provides this house. The man is very powerful and secretly supportive of the manuscript. You will be safe here. A porch light flickered on, and a short, squat man who appeared to be a native Peruvian rushed out, smiling broadly and saying something enthusiastically in Spanish. When he reached the Jeep, he patted Will on the back through the open window and glanced pleasantly over at me. Will asked him to speak in English, then introduced us. He needs a little help, Will said to the man. He wants to return to the States, but he'll have to be very careful. I guess I'm going to leave him with you. The man was looking closely at Will. You're about to go after the 9th insight again, aren't you? He asked. Yes, Will said, getting out of the Jeep. I opened my door and walked around the vehicle. Will and his friends were strolling toward the house having a conversation I couldn't hear. As I walked up to the man said, I will start the preparations, then walked away. Will turned to me. What did he mean, I asked, when he asked you about a 9th insight? There is a part of the manuscript that has been found. There were 8 insights with the original text, but one more insight, the 9th, was mentioned there. Many people have been searching for it. Do you know where it is? No, not really. Then how are you going to find it? Will smiled. The same way Jose found the original 8. The same way you found the first 2 and then ran into me. If one can connect and build up enough energy, then coincidental events begin to happen consistently. Tell me how to do that, I said. Which insight is it? Will looked at me as assessing my level of understanding. How to connect is not just one insight, it's all of them. Remember in the second insight where it describes how explorers would be sent out into the world utilizing the scientific method to discover the meaning of human life on this planet. But they would not return right away. Yes. Well, the remainder of the insights represent the answers finally coming back. But they aren't just coming from institutional science. The answers I'm talking about are coming from many different areas of inquiry. The findings of physics, psychology, mysticism, and religion are all coming together into a new thesis based on a perception of the coincidences. We're learning the details of what the coincidences mean, how they work, and as we do, we're concentrating a whole new view of life, insight by insight. Then I want to hear about each insight, I said. Can you explain them to me before you go? I found it doesn't work that way. You must discover each one of them in a different way. How? It just happens. It wouldn't work for me to just tell you. You might have the information about each of them, but you wouldn't have the insights. You would have to discover them in the course of your own life. We stared at each other in silence. Will smiled. Talking with him made me feel incredibly alive. Why are you going after the ninth insight? I asked. It's the first time I've been a guide here, and I know the terrain, and I understand all 8 insights. When I was at my window over the alley thinking of Jose, I had already decided to go north. One more time. The ninth insight is out there. I know it. And I'm not getting any younger. Besides, I've envisioned myself finding it and achieving what it says. I know it is the most important of the insights. It puts all the others into perspective and gives us the true purpose of life. He paused suddenly, looking serious. I would have left 30 minutes earlier, but I had this nagging feeling that I had forgotten something. He paused again. That's precisely when you showed up. We looked at each other for a long time. You think I'm supposed to go with you? I asked. What do you think? I don't know, I said, unsure of myself. I felt confused. The story of my Peruvian trip was flashing before my mind. Charlene, Dobson, and now Will. I had come. Hey, somebody done popped in. Hello, hello, hello.
Oh, my big brother.
How the heck are you?
Good. How are you?
Oh, I was just reading away until you popped in.
Hey, what book you reading?
Oh, let me show you.
Okay.
Have you ever read it?
Nope.
Oh, it's a fantastic book. But it is written in story form, so when I read it, I'm reading a story.
Mm-hmm.
Okay? So I guess I'll just go ahead and continue where I left off before you popped in.
Okay.
And briefly, he met this girl that told him about a manuscript. They had coffee and they talked and so on. And then they both went back home. And then he took a trip to Peru. And he met a man by Dobson who the police come and picked up. And he got away. And that's about where we're at.
Okay.
Well, he met a guy by the name of Will who's trying to help him get out of the country. We looked at each other for a long time. You think I'm supposed to go with you? I asked. Will said, well, what do you think? I don't know. I said, I'm unsure of myself. I felt confused. The story of my Peruvian trip, I can't say that word, was flashing before my mind. Charlene, Dobson, and now Will had come to Peru because of a mild curiosity, and now I found myself in hiding, an unwitting fugitive who didn't even know who his pursuers were. And the strangest thing of all was that at this moment, instead of being terrified, totally panicked, I found myself in a state of excitement. I should have been summoning all my wits and instincts to find a way home. But what I really wanted to do was to go with Will into what would undoubtedly be more dangerous. As I considered my options, I realized that in reality, I had no choice. The second insight had ended my possibility of going back to my old preoccupations. If I was going to stay aware, I had to go forward. I plan to spend the night, Will said, so you will have until tomorrow morning to decide. I've already decided, I told him. I want to go. We're into the next chapter. A matter of energy. We rose at dawn and drove east all morning in virtual silence. Early on, Will had mentioned that we would drive straight across the Andes into what he called the High Saval, an area consisting of forest-covered foothills and plateaus. But he had said little else. I had asked him several questions about his background and about our destination, but he had politely put me off, indicating he wanted to concentrate on driving. Finally, I had stopped talking altogether and had focused instead on the scenery. The views from the mountain peaks were staggering. About noon, when we had reached the last of the towering ridges, we stopped and overlooked to eat a lunch of sandwiches in the Jeep and to gaze out at the wide, barren valley ahead. On the other side of the valley were smaller foothills, green with plant life. As we ate, Will said we would spend the night at the Vincent Lodge, an old 19th century estate which formerly belonged to the Spanish Catholic Church. The city was now owned by a friend of his. He explained and was operated as a resort specializing in business and scientific conferences. With only that brief explanation, we departed and rode silently again. An hour later, we arrived at Vicenti's, entering the property through a large iron and stone gate and proceeding northeast up a narrow gravel drive. Once more, I asked a few probing questions concerning Vicenti and why we were here. But as he had done earlier, Will brushed aside my inquiries, only this time he suggested outright that I focus on the landscape. Immediately, the beauty of Vicenti touched me. We were surrounded by colorful pastures and orchards, and the grass seemed unusually green and healthy. It grew thickly, even under the giant oaks that rose up every 100 feet or so throughout the pastures. Something about these huge trees seemed incredibly attractive, but I couldn't quite grasp what. After about a mile, the road bent east and up a slight rise. At the top of the knoll was the lodge, a large Spanish-style building constructed of heavy timbers and gray stone. The structure appeared to contain at least 50 rooms, and a large screened porch covered the entire south wall. The yard around the lodge was marked by more gigantic oaks and contained beds of exotic plants and walkways trimmed with dazzling flowers and ferns. Couples of people talked idly on the porch and among the trees. As we got out of the vehicle, Will lingered a moment and gazed out at the view. Beyond the lodge to the east, the land sloped gradually downward, then flattened out into the meadows and forest. Another range of foothills appeared bluish purple in the distance. I think I'd go in and make sure they have room for us, Will said. Why don't you spend some time looking around? You've got to like this place. No kidding, I said. As he walked away, he turned and looked at me. Be sure to check out the research gardens. I'll see you at dinner time. Will was obviously leaving me alone for some reason, but I didn't care. Why I felt great and not the least bit apprehensive, Will had already told me that because of the substantial tourist dollar that Senti brought into the country, the government had always taken a hands-off approach to the place, even though the manuscript was often discussed here. Several large trees and a winding path toward the south attracted me, so I walked that way. Once I reached the trees, I could see that the walkway proceeded through a small iron gate and down several tiers of stone steps to a meadow filled with wildflowers. In the distance was an orchard of some kind and a small creek and more forest land. At the gate, I stopped and took several deep breaths, admiring the beauty below. It's certainly lovely, isn't it? A voice from behind me asked. I turned quickly. A woman in her late 30s, carrying a hiking pack, stood behind me. It certainly is, I said. I've never seen anything quite like it. For a moment, we looked out at the open fields and at the cascading tropical plants and the terraced beds on each side of us. Then I asked, do you happen to know where the research gardens are? Sure, she said. I'm heading that way now. I'll show you. After introducing ourselves, we walked down the steps and onto the well-worn path heading south. Her name was Sarah Lorner, and she was sandy-haired and blue-eyed and could have been described as girlish except for her serious demeanor. We walked for several minutes in silence. Is this your first visit here? She asked. Yes, it is, I replied. I don't know much about this place. Well, I've been here on and off for almost a year now, so I can fill you in a bit. About 20 years ago, this estate became popular as a sort of international scientific hangout. Various scientific organizations had their meetings here, biologists and physicists mainly. Then a few years ago, she hesitated for an instant and looked at me. Have you heard of the manuscript that was discovered here in Peru? Yes, I have, I said. I've heard about the first two insights. I wanted to tell her how fascinated I was with the document, but I held back, wondering whether to trust her completely. I thought maybe that was the case, she said. It looked as if you were picking up on the energy here. He was crossing a wooden bridge. We were crossing a wooden bridge which traversed the creek. What energy? I asked. She stopped and leaned back against the railing of the bridge. Do you know anything about the third insight? Nothing. It describes a new understanding of the physical world. It says we humans will learn to perceive what was formerly an invisible type of energy. The lodge has become a gathering place for those scientists interested in studying and talking about the phenomenon. Then scientists think the energy is real, I asked. She was turning to walk across the bridge. Only a few, she said, and we take some heat for it. You're a scientist then. I teach physics at a small college in Maine. So why are some scientists disagreeing with you? She was silent for a moment, as if in thought. You have to understand the history of science, she said, glancing at me as if to ask whether I wanted to get deeper into the subject. I nodded for her to proceed. Think about the second insight for a moment. After the fall of the medieval world view, we in the West suddenly became aware that we lived in a totally unknown universe. In attempting to understand the nature of this universe, we knew we had to somehow separate fact from superstition. In this regard, we scientists assumed a particular attitude known as scientific speculatism, which in effect demands solid evidence for any new assertion about how the world works. Before we would believe anything, we wanted evidence that could be seen and grabbed with the hands. Any idea that couldn't be proven in some physical way was systematically rejected. God knows, she continued, this attitude served us well with the more obvious phenomena in nature, with objects such as rocks and bodies and trees, objects everyone can perceive no matter how skeptical they are. We quickly went out and named every part of the physical world, attempting to discover why the universe operated as it did. We finally concluded that everything that occurs in nature does so according to some natural law, that each event has a direct physical and understandable cause. She smiled at me knowingly. You see, in many ways, scientists have been that different from others in our time period. We decided, along with everyone else, to master this place in which we found ourselves. The idea was to create an understanding of the universe that made the world seem safe and manageable. And the skeptical attitude kept us focused on concrete problems that would make our existence seem more secure. We had followed the meandering path from the bridge through a small meadow and into an area more deeply covered with trees. With this attitude, she went on, science systematically removed the uncertain and the esoteric from the world. We concluded, following the thinking of Isaac Newton, that the universe always operated in a predictable manner, like an enormous machine, because for a long time that's all it could be proved to be. Events which happened simultaneously to other events yet had no causal relationship were said to occur only by chance. Then two investigations occurred which opened our eyes again to the mystery of the universe. Much has been written over the past several decades about the revolution in physics, but the changes really stemmed from two major findings, those of quantum mechanics and those of Albert Einstein. The whole of Einstein's life work was to show that what we perceive as hard matter is mostly empty space, with a pattern of energy running through it. This includes ourselves, and what quantum physics has shown is that when we look at these patterns of energy at smaller and smaller levels, startling results can be seen. Experiments have revealed that when you break apart small aspects of this energy, what we call elementary particles, and try to observe how they operate, the act of observation itself alters the results, as if these elementary particles are influenced by what the experimenter expects. This is true even if the particles must appear in places they couldn't possibly go. Given the laws of the universe as we know them, two places at the same moment forward or backward in time, that sort of thing. She stopped to face me again. In other words, the basic stuff of the universe at its core is looking like a kind of pure energy that is malleable to human intention and expectation in a way that defies our old mechanistic model of the universe, as though our expectation itself causes our energy to flow out into the world and affect other energy systems, which of course is exactly what the third insight would lead us to believe. She shook her head. Unfortunately, most scientists don't take this idea seriously. They would rather remain skeptical and wait to see if we can prove it. Hey, Sarah, here we are over again. Here we are over here. A voice called faintly from a distance. To the right, about 50 yards through the trees, we could see someone waving. Sarah looked at me. I need to go talk with those guys for a few minutes. I have a translation of the third insight with me if you would like to pick out a spot and read some of it while I'm gone. I sure would, I said. She pulled a folder from her pack, handed it to me, and walked away. I took the folder and looked around for a place to sit down. Here, the forest floor was dense with small bushes and was slightly soggy. But to the east, and land rose toward what looked like another knoll. I decided to walk in that direction in search of dry ground. At the top of the rise, I was awestruck. It was another spot of incredible beauty. The garnered oaks were spaced about 50 feet apart, and their wide limbs grew completely together at the top, creating a canopy overhead. On the forest floor grew broad-leafed tropical plants which stood 4 or 5 feet high and had leaves up to 10 inches in width. These plants were interspiraled with large ferns and bushes lush with white flowers. I picked out a dry place and sat down. I could smell the musty odor of the leaves and the fragrance of the blossoms. I opened the folder and turned to the beginning of the translation. A brief introduction explained that the third insight brings a transformed understanding of the physical universe. Its words clearly echoed Sarah's summary. Sometimes, near the end of the second millennium, it predicted that humans would discover a new energy which formed the basis of and radiated outward from all things, including ourselves. I pondered that idea for a moment, then reading something that fascinated me. Manuscript said that human perception of this energy first begins with a heightened sensitivity of beauty. As I thought about this, the sound of someone walking along the path below drew my attention. I saw Sarah at the exact moment she looked toward the knoll and spotted me. "This place is great," she said when she reached me. "Have you come to the part about the perception of beauty yet?" "Yes," I said, "but I'm not sure what that means." Further, in the manuscript, she said, it goes into more detail, but I'll explain it briefly. The perception of beauty is a kind of barometer telling each of us how close we are to actually perceiving the energy. This is clear because once you observe this energy, you realize It's on the same continuum as beauty. You sound like you see it, I said. She looked at me without the slightest self-consciousness. Yes, I do. But the first thing I developed was a deeper appreciation of beauty. But how does that work? Isn't beauty relative? She shook her head. The thing that we perceive as beautiful may be different, but the actual characteristics we ascribe to beautiful objects are similar. Think about it. When somebody strikes us as beautiful, it displays more presence and sharpness of shape and vividness of color, doesn't it? It stands out. It shines. It seems almost iridescent compared to the dullness of other objects less attractive. I nodded. Look at this spot, she continued. I know you are blown away by it because we all are. This place leaps out at you. The colors and the shapes seem magnified. Well, the very next level of perception is to see an energy field hovering above everything. I must have looked bewildered because she laughed. Then said very seriously, perhaps we should walk on to the gardens. They're about a half a mile further south. I think you'll find them interesting. I thanked her for taking the time to explain the manuscript to me, a total stranger, and for showing me around Vicente. She shrugged her shoulders. You seem like a person friendly to what we're trying to do, she said, and we all know we're involved in a public relations effort here. For this research to continue, we must get the word out in the United States and elsewhere. The local authorities don't seem to like us much. Suddenly a voice called out from behind, "Excuse me, please." We turned to see three men walking quickly up the path toward us. All appeared to be their late 40s and were dressed in stylish clothes. Would one of you tell me where the research gardens are? The taller of the three asked. Could you tell me what business here is? Sarah asked in return. My colleagues and I have permission from the owner of this estate to examine the gardens and to speak with someone about the so-called research being conducted here. We are from the University of Peru. Sounds as though you're not in agreement with our findings, Sarah said, smiling, obviously trying to lighten the situation. Absolutely not, another one of the men said. We think it's preposterous to claim that some mysterious energy can now be seen when it has never been observed before. Have you tried to see it? Sarah inquired. The man ignored the question and asked again, can you direct us to the gardens? Of course, Sarah said. About 100 yards ahead, you will see a path turning east. Take it, and ahead maybe a quarter of a mile, you'll run into them. Thank you, the tall man said, and as they hurried on their way. You send them in the wrong direction, I said. Not really, she replied. There are other gardens in that area, and the people there are more prepared to talk with these kind of skeptics. We get people like this through here occasionally, and not just scientists, but curiosity seekers as well. People who can't begin to grasp what we're doing, which points out the problem that exists in scientific understanding. What do you mean? I asked. As I said before, the old skeptical attitude was great when exploring the more visible and obvious phenomena in the universe, such as trees or sunshine or thunderstorms. But there is another group of observable phenomenon more stubble that you aren't can't study. In fact, you can't even tell they're there at all unless you suspend or bracket your skepticism and try every very way possible to perceive them. Once you can, then you return to your righteous study. Interesting, I said. Ahead, the woods ended, and I could see dozens of cultivated plots, each one growing a different type of plant. Most seemed to be food-bearing types, everything from bananas to spinach. At the eastern border of each crop was a wide gravel path which ran north to what appeared to be a public road. 3 metal outbuildings were spaced along the path. 4 or 5 people worked near each one. Excuse me. I see some friends of mine, Sarah said, and pointed toward the closest building. Let's go over there. I'd like for you to meet them. Sarah introduced me to 3 men and 1 woman, all of whom were involved in the research. The men spoke with me briefly, then excused themselves to continue their work. But the woman, a biologist named Marjorie, seemed free to talk. I caught Marjorie's eye. What exactly are you researching here? I asked. She appeared to be taken off guard, but smiled and finally answered. It's hard to know where to start, she said. Are you familiar with the manuscript? The first sections of it, I commented. I've just begun the 3rd insight. Well, that's what we're all about here. Come, I'll show you. She motioned for me to follow her, and we walked around the metal buildings to a plot of beans. I noticed they appeared to be exceptionally healthy, with no noticeable insect damage or dead leaves. The plants were growing in what appeared to be a highly humus, almost fluffy soil, and each plant was carefully spaced, and stems and leaves of one growing near but never touching those of the next. She pointed to the closest plant. We tried to look at these plants as total energy systems and think of everything they need to flourish. Soil, nutrients, moisture, light. What we have found is that the total ecosystem around each plant is really one living system, one organism, and the health of each of the plants impacts on the health of the whole. She hesitated, then said, the basic point is that once we started thinking about the energy relationships all around the plants, then we started seeing amazing results. The plants in our studies were not particularly large, but according to nutritional criteria, they were more potent. How was that? I measured. They contain more protein, carbohydrates, vitamins, minerals. She looked at me expectantly, but that wasn't the most amazing thing we found. But the plants, which had the most direct human attention, were even more potent. What kind of attention? I asked. You know, she said, fiddling with the ground around them, checking them every day, that sort of thing. We set up an experiment with a control group, some getting special attention, others not, and the finding was confirmed. What's more, she continued, we expanded the concept and had a research not just give them attention, but to mentally ask them to grow stronger. The person would actually sit with them and focus all his attention and concern on their growth. Did they grow stronger? By significant amounts, and they also grew faster. That's incredible. And that's where we will stop. And on Thursday, we'll come back and continue to read on. I enjoy reading this because it's really a fascinating book, and I hope you enjoy listening to it. If I can ever get, for some reason, I can't seem to get comfortable this morning, but that's all right. Then, of course, my sinus is driving me crazy, and that's, what else can I say? Anyway, that's it for today. We'll see you on Thursday. And everybody have a great and fantastic day. Thank you for coming. Have a great day. Bye.